Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here. And Andy Liebman just gave a great speech, and it's very hard to follow that kind of wisdom that he talked about his 7 lessons. I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal recollections of the 1973 war, give some of the context about what we faced, how we handled it or didn't handle it. And I think it'll be very interesting. I do, of course, want to thank CIA Historical Collection Division for declassifying the 400-odd documents, some of which I helped create at one time. And I also am very honored to be here at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and the fact that it's helping sponsor this. I'm also honored to be here with many of my friends, people I worked with years ago. I could talk about all of them and name all of them, but I want to just say I'm especially honored to be part of a symposium that features Dick Kovar, who taught me a lot about critical thinking, writing, and intelligence analysis. This is very much a personal account of what to some seems to be very distant history, refreshed by these 400-odd documents that's been declassified, and trying to think accurately and with relevance what occurred back in 1973 is very hard. So if there are any inaccuracies, I know that Dick Kovar will certainly correct them. Let me just explain my role at the time. I had entered the CIA in 1958. I had advanced to being a senior analyst and branch chief in the elite Office of Current Intelligence by 1971. Spent a year at the War College, came back, worked on the President's Daily Brief for over a year. At that stage, we transitioned from Jim Schlesinger to Bill Colby. Bill Colby innovated by having a newspaper form for the President's Daily Brief, which people forget. I didn't particularly like that form. I was very perplexed by trying to formulate the headlines. I found the hardest thing was to capture the essence of this intelligence brief, because you only had a certain number of spaces in order to do a title if it's a newspaper. But Colby was very proud of it. He really did like it. Working for the President's Daily Brief is always, it's invigorating. You learn about the most sensitive intelligence activities of the community and the CIA, and expose me to writing and to critical thinking skills. In early 1973, I was asked by Dick Lehman, who ran the Office of Current Intelligence, and by Bruce Clark, Jr., who ran the Office of Strategic Research, which did in-depth military intelligence, and to become head of production, current military intelligence production in the Office of Strategic Research, on loan from the Office of Current Intelligence. At that time, Bruce Clark said he was under pressure from the Office of Weapons Intelligence, also from what was known as the Foreign Missile Space Analysis Center, or FLIMSAC, to get more of their technical intelligence into CIA current publications and to improve the quality overall and writing for current intelligence of military analysis. I found this a very challenging assignment, and I thought, though, running current military production in what was then called the Regional Analysis Division of the Office of Strategic Research to be really a great job. We worked on Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and South Asia. Both Bruce Clark and Dick Lehman were pleased with the results. Being a production manager, Dick Kovar knows how to do this. Evan Heinemann, who was head of the Foreign Missile Space Activities Center, and later Director of Science and Technology at CIA, he also was pleased because he got more of his technical assessments in it. But he came over to see Bruce Clark, and he said to Bruce Clark, "Who is this guy, Allen? He's turning my great technical assessments into Peter Rabbit English." So I'll always remember Bruce calling me in and saying, "You've just been called the guy who writes Peter Rabbit English." I only recall too well the difficulty of assessing Egyptian intentions opposite Sinai in 1973. You must remember that Egypt conducted military exercises in May and August causing Israeli mobilization twice at great cost to Tel Aviv. I recall working with the head of the Middle East South Asian branch of the Regional Analysis Division of the Office of Strategic Research to ensure that we had the right kind of collection, technical, human. So we had the requirements out, and we understood pretty well the Soviet military shipments into Damascus and into Cairo. We did not always know the content, excuse me, the content of what was in the shipments, but we knew that they were very sizable back in those years. Our understanding of Egyptian and Syrian forces and their locations was only fair. Our understanding of Cairo's and Damascus' military intention were very poor. At the time, we lacked near real-time space imagery capability, something we take for granted today, and we depended instead on film capsules that were returned from space periodically, captured by an aircraft over Hawaii, and then we raced the film up to Rochester, New York, to Eastman Kodak, where we had a Tiger team ready to read out the results. So our technical collection in the form of imagery and the force dispositions of Egypt and Syria was surprisingly not that good. We had other technical intelligence, which was good, but it did not give us the depth or breadth of trying to understand the intention of either Arab state. I recall in late September, Egyptian forces arrayed along the Suez Canal again began exercises. We also detected exercise activity along the Israeli-Syrian ceasefire line in the Golan Heights. We did have a human source reporting that the Syrians were planning a massive assault upon Israel involving at least 4 Syrian divisions. That's in one of the documents declassified. The Syrian forces reportedly would be in place by the end of September for the attack. Well, we pressed CIA's clandestine service and U.S. technical collection for additional clarifying information. Attaché reporting from Damascus was good, not great. I can't recall any really good attaché reporting from Cairo. In late September, we were further alarmed when Moscow began withdrawing dependents. This is late September, from the Soviet embassy in Cairo. Now, if there ever was a great warning indicator, it was when this occurred. In retrospect, it's hard to fathom why we, and I, and CIA did not issue strategic warning of possible war in the Middle East. The Soviets knew things that we didn't know. We also had information that the Egyptian government was using civil transport to move troops and equipment towards the Suez Canal. Now, if there's ever a classical indicator of genuine preparation for war, when you disrupt civil society, this was it. In retrospect, pretty clear. The recall of the Soviet dependents did prompt the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, to send a cable to the chiefs of mission in key Middle Eastern countries. And further, Dr. Kissinger asked Bill Colby to send a cable to the region, urgently requesting assessments of the possibility that war could break out in the Middle East. I recall distinctly reading the reporting of those questions that were sent to the field. The chiefs of mission, the chiefs of stations agreed that tensions were high and that developments were making them uneasy. But they did not foresee any immediate likelihood of hostilities erupting in the Middle East. The Israeli intelligence services were unanimous that neither Egypt nor Syria, individually or combined, were prepared to attack Israel. The hubris with which the Israelis responded to U.S. queries was sort of palpable. I still remember that. Despite the worries we had in Washington, the vigor with which the Israeli intelligence services responded, I think, had a tremendous effect on agency assessments. I just can't overstate that. And it's now fascinating to read the declassified assessment that Ray Klein, then Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research, sent to Henry Kissinger on 30 September 1973. Dr. Klein, he's a former and greatly revered CIA operations officer, stated that there are reports that Syria is preparing to attack Israel, but conclusive evidence is lacking. Then he states further, in our view, the political climate in the Arab state argues against a major Syrian military move against Israel at this time. That was about 6-7 days before war broke out. During the period of increased tension, part of my duties in the Office of Strategic Research was to work with the Watch Committee of the United States Intelligence Board. The committee was established by Walter Beadle Smith in 1953 to provide warning of any surprise attack against the United States and its allies. The USIB, as we called it, the United States Intelligence Board Watch Committee, was composed of senior intelligence officers at the general officer or senior colonel level representing the major intelligence agencies, chaired by the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. It met weekly during non-crisis times and daily during crises. And it approved every Friday morning you got a Watch Committee report. The head of the staff that supported the Watch Committee was the National Indication Center. Had about 25 officers. The head was a CIA officer named Thaxter Swan, known as Tax Swan. Very experienced CIA officer who had worked in both operations and analysis. I remember he came to me and to other officers in the Regional Analysis Division on 1 October 1973 to coordinate the Watch Committee report for 5 October. On 4 October, we concurred in the following language for the Watch Committee, and I quote, "We continue to believe that an outbreak of major Arab-Israeli hostility remains unlikely for the immediate future, although the risk of localized fighting has increased slightly as a result of the buildup of Syrian forces in the vicinity of the Golan Heights. Egyptian exercise activity underway since late September may also contribute to the possibility of incidents." That was it. On October the 5th, which was a Friday, in 1973, I spent a good deal of the day working with the analysts, both in the Office of Current Intelligence and the Office of Strategic Research, on a Central Intelligence Bulletin, from which a President's Daily Brief was written, on the continuing military activity in both Egypt and Syria. We assessed the state of activity in Egypt, including the alert of Egyptian air defense and air forces, as well as their ground and naval shipments, was worrying. We rationalized, however, that Cairo usually conducts such activities in the fall and the spring. Our lead sentence for the Current Intelligence Bulletin, which will live forever in my mind, stated as follows, quote, "The exercise and the activities underway in Egypt may be on a somewhat larger scale and more realistic than previous exercises, but they do not appear to be preparations for a military offensive against Israel," unquote. I remember distinctly putting to bed this Current Intelligence Bulletin about 2,000 hours on that Friday evening and stopping by CIA's Operations Center to see if any new intelligence had arrived. I was told by a watch officer that Fatah had gone on a war footing. This worried me a bit. I thought about calling in analysts to take a look at this and other material that seemed to be flowing in increased volume into the Ops Center, but it was Friday, been a long week. So I went home. At 0300 hours, my home telephone rang on 6 October. My wife passed the phone to me. On the other end of the connection was John Paisley, Deputy Director of the Office of Strategic Research, very brilliant and accomplished CIA officer. He said, "Come to work. Report to Dick Lehman. Dick Lehman will chair at 0900 hours a meeting of the Watch Committee." He further stated that the combined armies of Egypt and Syria would attack Israel in 4 hours. And there was nothing the Israelis could do to stop the attack because it takes Tel Aviv Defense Forces 72 hours to mobilize. My only question was, are you certain? Paisley said, Golda Meir has called Henry Kissinger to inform him of these facts, and the information is A1, which means it's authentic. I raced to Langley, reviewed the intelligence that had arrived, from open source as well as classified. And then I joined Lehman, who was in a car waiting, and we went off to the Pentagon. Lehman began chairing the Watch Committee just about 0900 hours with a lot of notable military and civilian intelligence officers, healthy number of action officers racing back and forth. Reports are beginning to flow that Egyptian forces were poised to cross or were crossing the canal. The intelligence flow increased, action officers moved with greater rapidity, and at 0900 hours we had reports of dogfights over Goal Line between Israeli aircraft and Syrian aircraft. At this point, Dick Lehman, a very, very revered officer, said, "Gentlemen, there were no women members of the Watch Committee in those days. We can do no good here. I suggest we return to our respected officers where we might actually be able to do some good." So those were very, very, that was a very interesting and paralyzing event. When we returned to Langley, all the senior officers of the Directorate of Intelligence were present. Dr. William, known as Bill Parmenter, Director of Middle East and African Division, Office of Current Intelligence, took the lead on what the agency should do next. He was a distinguished and decisive individual, armed with a doctorate from Harvard on colonial African history. He told Dick Lehman that plans were underway to establish the CIA task force, and he wanted Dick Kovar to head the task force. Kovar, of course, as I pointed out, was one of the agency's most distinguished intelligence analysts, an extraordinarily gifted writer and editor. He was generally viewed without peer in production management, having served in a whole series of senior analytic capacities. Bruce Clark, head of Office of Strategic Research, stated that he wanted me to be the task force military deputy responsible for military analysis. The CIA task force took form in a hurry. We simply used a large conference room next to the operations center and some adjoining offices. There was space for us to operate. Dick Lehman, Bruce Clark, and Bill Parmenter said we would turn out a situation report every 4 hours around the clock, 7 by 24, until the conflict in the Middle East came to closure. The Director of Operations, which was adjacent to the task force, also was in easy reach to ask for the latest from our clandestine collectors abroad. Life became incredibly busy. Dick Kovar was in charge of integrating the overall situation reports and other intelligence assessments for the DCI and policy officials downtown. We coordinated our sit reps with DIA so we would not be out of kilter with their analysts that did military intelligence across the river, down the river. So the reports we turned out, the situation reports, many of which have been declassified, served as a basis for the President's daily briefs, the current intelligence bulletins. And I don't intend to go through the next 3 weeks of situation report by situation report. You can read the declassified documents, draw your own conclusions as to their adequacy. What was painfully obvious at the time, and today retrospectively, was our limitations in collection and analysis, but more importantly, our overdependence on Israeli intelligence during the build-up to hostilities and in the days that immediately followed the opening of combat. These weaknesses, combined with our eyes shuttered by the Israeli success in the Six-Day War in 1967, tended to significantly affect our judgments in the early days of the war. The view within the intelligence community generally was that although surprised, the Israeli IDF would soon reverse any gains made by the Arab armies. The declassified minutes of the Washington Special Action Group of 6 October 1973 are instructive in this regard. In the briefing at the WASEG, as it was known, DCI Colby acknowledges that the Egyptians had made, quote, some progress over the canal, unquote, but later into a response from Secretary Kissinger on how long it will take Israel to push them out, Colby stated, quote, a couple of days, unquote. Colby was equally confident and stated that on the Golan Heights, the Israelis appear to have contained the Syrian forces. The DCI made these comments before the WASEG even while the Watch Committee over in the Pentagon was trying to wrap up what was really going on and was having difficulty concluding a major war was underway. That's very true. So I think the DCI Colby, a very smart man, was going with his gut, and his comments at that stage were not informed even by our most current reporting, but by the view that Arab armies, even though they had attacked in a surprise attack, that they could not achieve the kind of goals that both Hafez al-Assad and President Sadat of Egypt had set forth. The declassified WASEG minutes of 7 October 1973 reflect a more sober meeting of principles and one that's somewhat better informed by intelligence. For example, Colby speaks of a large force on the heights, the Golan Heights, 3 infantry and 1 armored division. And then he says they are doing better than they did in 1967. In responding to a question from Kenneth Rush of the Department of State on why the Israelis were so grim, Colby said, and I quote, "because they have a real problem on the Golan Heights," unquote. He also notes the Israelis are taking substantial casualties and that Israel may fear a Syrian breakthrough. Colby had begun the meeting by stating that the Israelis had destroyed most of the bridges, the pontoon bridges by the Egyptians that they put over the canal. And he says they've destroyed 8. Later in the meeting, Deputy Secretary of Defense Clements asked about the accuracy of the information on the bridges. Admiral Moore, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, "Well, that's the Israeli story," unquote. Secretary of Defense Jim Schlesinger at this point made a very salient comment that's in the declassified document. He simply states, quote, "We're completely dependent on the Israelis for our information," unquote. Because, that's not exactly true, but he was a bit overwrought at that stage. Because of this heavy dependence initially on Israeli intelligence, our situation reports, our current intelligence bulletins, our President daily briefs reflected heavily what the Israelis told us. For example, the number of floating bridges across the canal and whether they were operational was a burning question of the WASEG members. Because the bridges were inside Egypt's surface-to-air missile systems envelope, it made the reconnaissance by the Israelis difficult without losing a lot of aircraft. So, you know, we certainly began to understand that how dependent we were on the Israelis, and we had to recalibrate in many ways, and we did that. We were equally dependent on the Israelis for the number of troops that had actually crossed the canal. And our early analysis was not exactly accurate. The Egyptians, in fact, had succeeded in getting far more men and heavy equipment across the canal than ever anticipated by U.S. intelligence. By 10 or 11 October, our assessments were more accurate. We estimated that 600 to 700 tanks and 30 to 40,000 Egyptian troops were across the canal. In addition, because of our dependency on the Israelis, we're unable to report with any certitude in our analysis on what was occurring up in the Golan Heights. Despite reassurances by the Israelis that they were containing the Syrian forces, it became clear that the Syrians had pushed into the heights as far as the town of Quneitra. So Syrian forces, moreover, held this town for several days, resisting a number of Israeli counterattacks. But in my view, our analysis improved in depth and breadth after this shaky beginning. It became more detailed, and its accuracy increased to such an extent that WASEG members were alarmed by 10-11 October on whether the Israelis were suffering ammunition and equipment shortages. Secretary Kissinger did not hesitate at this point to direct a massive U.S. air bridge, which was executed over the next several weeks with remarkable success. At the task force level, we were beginning to understand the military situation and the increasing difficulties of the Israeli forces. Although we assessed with confidence that the Israelis would prevail on both fronts, we knew that they were incurring substantial casualties and that they would require for the United States to provide resupply immediately. One of the bright spots was our understanding of Soviet military resupply efforts to both Egypt and Syria. Although we were not always knowledgeable about what was in the shipments, either by sea or by air, we certainly knew with great specificity of the number of flights, the number of ships, and we did have some information on cargoes and contents. We're also aware at the time that Soviet troops in Egypt were there who were associated with the surface-to-air Scud missile system. I have a little more to say about that later. When Kissinger stated that the U.S. airlift should exceed that of the Soviets by 25%, I think the U.S. military knew from our intelligence just how to execute that directive. Our collection of intelligence, both from technical and human sources, improved significantly, and our military assessments are very deep and detailed. However, we were still frustrated by our lack of timely imagery of the battlefields. The United States film return system, we had a satellite in orbit, was not scheduled to be returned to Earth until the end of October, not very helpful to us at the time. So we could not get, as a consequence, an accurate order of battle of Syrian and Egyptian forces or their disposition. More importantly, we could not assess with confidence the damage incurred by the forces fighting in Egypt or on the Golan Heights. The declassified WASC meetings reflect some of this frustration. And to manage this shortfall, U.S. intelligence urged that we have a SR-71 Blackbird mission over Egypt, down the Suez Canal, and up over the Golan Heights. As I recall, this mission was flown on the 13th of October. The plane, the SR-71, had to fly from Shaw Air Force Base, I believe in South Carolina, and return. Had a number of refuelings. It was a long, difficult flight. We sent a Tiger team again up to Eastman Kodak to do the immediate assessment. So Colby, at the WASEG meeting on the 16th of October, was able to give a preliminary assessment from the SR mission, which was very successful. Along the canal, there were 444 Israeli tanks with 52 destroyed, 835 Egyptian tanks with 16 destroyed. Along the Golan Heights, there were 419 Israeli tanks with 36 destroyed, 339 Syrian tanks with 7 destroyed. Dr. Kissinger noted during this exchange, well, there must be more than 7 destroyed on the Syrian front. He says, I do not believe that the Israeli claim of 800 tanks destroyed, but there must be more than 7. When Colby said, I agree, Kissinger stated, and it showed even in this great crisis, even the tremendous group that was formed, the WASEG group, which was, as you read the minutes, you're awed by the decision-making and by the brilliance of the people around the table. So Kissinger says, well, I like precise intelligence, somewhere between 7 and 800. It's a quote directly from the minutes. I think it's a tremendous quote. Needless to say, the SR-71 flight was extraordinarily useful, not only in the United States, but to military planners in Israel. We saw and we knew that Israeli armor planned to attack across the canal in a seam between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies. That we did know. The SR-71 imagery showed this seam, and within a day or two, the Israelis had not only crossed the canal, but with some heavy armor, were moving to cut off the Egyptian 3rd Army. Because of technical intelligence, we're able to track the Israeli movements with some precision. It was at that point I was directed by Bruce Clark or Dick Lehman, I can't remember who, to go with CIA's Office of Congressional Affairs to brief Senator Scoop Jackson, the famous Cold Warrior, anti-communist Democrat, whose support for the State of Israel was extraordinarily strong, on the Israeli breakout across the canal. I remember we met Senator Jackson in his office, not in a skiff, I think, as we were supposed to, but we quickly told him of the Israeli successes across the canal. We had imagery demonstrating this. I remember Senator Jackson responding enthusiastically. By the time we left, about an hour later, he was almost giddy with delight over the Israeli advances. Very interesting for an officer, very objectively trying to assess the intelligence, but Senator Jackson's support of Israel was truly undiminished. As the Israelis gradually gathered the upper hand militarily, both in Sinai and the Egyptian front, we continued around-the-clock situation reports, contributing to the current intelligence bulletins and the President's daily briefs. Other duties included meetings with agency officials, and Dick Kovar did a lot of this, including DCI Colby. The DCI was easy to brief. It was amazingly informal and always grateful. And all of these tense days as the fighting grew, climaxed, and then began to die down, but as the possibility of a confrontation with the Soviet Union grew, I never heard Bill Colby once raise his voice or show irritation to the officers supporting him. He was always the lowest key person in the room. Once I remember walking with him and others to the DCI elevator as he was headed downtown for a WASIC meeting. I was briefing him on some classified late-breaking developments, which I'd only written down in handwritten form. Colby listened carefully, but then asked for my handwritten notes. So he was stuffing them into his pocket as he disappeared and the elevator door closed and he went on his way to the White House. That just showed the measure of Colby and his ability to be very calm, very cool under difficult circumstances. And I also had the opportunity at that time to frequently brief Ambassador, at the time he was Lieutenant General in uniform, Vernon Dick Walters. Dick Walters would arrive about 0600 every morning, and he would comment freely upon our analysis, bringing his own unique insights into what was occurring in the Middle East. He had a great interest in the movement of forces from other Arab states to join the Egyptian or Syrian front, and some declassified documents refer to these other Arab forces. He was familiar with many of the militaries. He had tremendous insight on the capabilities of Moroccan forces. He had worked with the Moroccan military in World War II and had respect for their courage and tenacity in fighting against German forces. Excuse me. General Walters was highly skeptical that 2 divisions promised by Saddam Hussein of Iraq would ever reach the Syrian front. And he was right. As far as I can recall, Iraqi forces never arrived in Syria until well after there was a ceasefire. It wasn't that far to move their forces. By October the 20th, the United States and the Soviet Union were working to broker a ceasefire under the aegis of the United Nations. The ceasefire, which went into effect on 22 October, unraveled quickly as the Israelis continued to attack and cut off Egypt's Third Army and the city of Suez. The crisis deepened as the Soviets indicated they would not stand by if the Israelis continued to annihilate the Third Army. I'll leave it to Dick Kovar and others to discuss this particular phase of the war. I do know, however, that the WASIG operated, as I said earlier, as an extraordinarily high level of professionalism and always under the confident leadership of Dr. Kissinger. In retrospect, the delicate decision-making as orchestrated by Kissinger, as the declassified WASIG minutes show, was absolutely exquisite as the tensions rose between the 2 superpowers. With the passage of years, it's interesting how little the world seems to recall there was a risk of confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union in October 1973. Neither I nor any of the military analysts had confidence that the 22 October ceasefire would hold, and we wrote that. What we did know was that the Soviet air bridge to Egypt and Damascus had been very heavy, and our concerns had arisen accordingly. I do recall on the 25th of October discussing repeatedly with Dr. Parmenter, Bill Parmenter, the potential insertion of Soviet paratroopers into Damascus. We're obtaining ambiguous information that Soviet paratroopers at Pskov were loading or about to load them onto transport aircraft. I remember we had flights going into both Cairo and Damascus on the 25th, but as usual, we did not know with great certitude the cargo. I remember Dr. Parmenter pressing me on this subject. He wasn't happy we could not give more precision. But of course, we didn't have the kind of real-time imagery that would show paratroopers uploading onto transport aircraft. We just didn't have it. What did happen, of course, was that President Nixon directed on the 25th of October to bring U.S. military forces to assume an increased alert, known as Defense Condition 3, DEFCON 3. We knew that all the airborne divisions were on alert, and the potential for Moscow to insert forces in the Middle East was rising. But we did not have national technical means at that time sufficient to support our crisis management. There was a very vital declassified report. It's a CIA memorandum dated 30 October 1973, entitled Soviet Nuclear Weapons in Egypt. It brought into sharp focus the question of how far the Soviets were prepared to go to protect their vital interests in the Middle East, especially with Egypt. As I recall, Dr. Fritz Ermarth, who was a senior official in the Office of Strategic Research, raised the issue of the possible introduction of Soviet nuclear weapons into Egypt fairly early on in the conflict. We knew tactical nuclear weapons could be used, that is, tactical nuclear weapons could be used with either with Scud missiles, either as a conventional warhead or with a nuclear weapon. I believe that probably Dr. Ermarth helped author that 30 October memorandum. It was a jarring memorandum, as I recall. We had some difficulty getting people within the intelligence community to believe that Moscow would introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East theater. But it was there. And this certainly strengthened the need for and the urgency for a permanent ceasefire. That ceasefire was reached on the 25th of October with great work between the Soviets and Dr. Kissinger, President Nixon. With the prospect of immediate Soviet intervention then beginning to recede, our principal task was to monitor the ceasefire to ensure it was holding, which, with minor exception, was the case. By the time we reached Situation Report number 93, CIA managers, especially Dr. Edward Proctor, the Deputy Director of Intelligence, the DDI, was more than prepared to disband the CIA task force, with the proviso it could be quickly reestablished if events warranted. I do recall, as the war wound down, that Dr. Proctor showed up late evening for a late evening briefing for me on the status of the conflict about 31 October at 1830 hours. I was editing one of the last military contributions to our sit rep. Dr. Proctor looked at me, he saw I was exhausted, and then he said, "You sleep and I will edit the report," which he did, and only Dr. Proctor would have done something like that. As I look back on those intense days just over 40 years ago, I remember the shock that rippled through CIA at Langley and the dismay that we had within the military analysts at CIA, as well as the rest of the intelligence community over our collective failure to provide any warning to the policy level. In the years that followed, I felt a personal responsibility for contributing to the failure to warn. In one way, the failure did serve as a catalyst for far-reaching reconsideration of the community's national warning strategy. The impetus for reform came, however, not from the intelligence community, but from a House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which reviewed warning. The report was produced by HPSI in 1978. It recommended that there should establish within the intelligence community a single focus for warning. It led to the establishment of the National Intelligence Officer for Warning position and the establishment of a national warning staff, which would be very objective and independent, that would support this National Intelligence Officer. Later, I had the honor for serving for 4 years in that position. The October 73 war, the failure, and he talked a little bit about that, seemed to epitomize failures that we had had in the past and failures we have had subsequently. Failure to re-examine some of our basic assumptions, as Andy said. Failure to understand abrupt discontinuity. Regional analysts thinking things will continue. As Bob Gates said at the National Foreign Intelligence Board in 1988, that abrupt discontinuity is sometimes the last individual to recognize that is a country desk analyst, the regional analyst. He or she tends to think things will continue. And as Secretary Schlesinger has said, we initially were overly dependent on our allies, the Israeli intelligence, trying to understand what was going on. We minimized also, which was very unfortunate, the military capabilities and objectives, getting back to Andy's comment, of Egypt and Syria. We played down the significance of military indicators that Egypt and Syria were intent on war and willing to pay an extremely high price in blood and treasure. We listened to the mistaken opinion of foreign leaders. We did that in 1990 when Saddam invaded Kuwait. We all should read Richard Shyrock's outstanding review of the intelligence community post-mortem program, 1973 to 1975. It's been declassified. Very instructive, should be required reading for young officers entering intelligence. The lessons, unfortunately, are hard to learn. We're a much better intelligence community than we've ever been. We have more intelligence. We understand it better. Our analysis is better. Our collection is far better in massive ways. But at the same time, my greatest concern of the U.S. intelligence community today involves our more current reporting, our more immediate reporting, our more tactical reporting, than looking strategically, doing that long-term assessment, and being rewarded for those long-term assessments, and being able to provide warning when required. When I became the NIO for warning, I had been personally seared, as John Gannon told me, a former Deputy Director of Intelligence at CIA, by the 1973 failure. When Saddam Hussein threatened to invade Kuwait, we thought, and we saw mobilization of Iraqi forces, we thought they were very genuine preparations for war. They were not a bluff or a feint. But they were causing dislocation of the civil economy in order to move forces rapidly to southern Iraq on the border with Kuwait. I and my staff issued warning of war around the 24th of July, and we issued warning of attack on the 1st of August. At that time, we still had problems competing with the broader, larger community agencies which accepted more reassuring messages and which went to our senior policymakers. We're in the 21st century. We have in the information age, we have whole new challenges on the expectations of intelligence and the vital necessity of intelligence in the information age. We have policymakers coming in who come from a different prism because they're used to using Wikipedia, or they can look up anything they want. For us to remain relevant and positive, we not only have to learn from the lessons of the past, but we have to deal and accept, I think, a lot of the 7 lessons that Andy Liebman stated in his earlier address. Again, it's a great honor to be here, great honor to speak here, great honor to think back 40 years and to think about what we did right, what we did wrong. We were blessed by a great leadership at the White House in this great crisis, and we got through it. But it was a dangerous time. It really did lead to in many ways, to the peace accords in the late 1970s at Camp David. So thank you again. Thank you very much.